good morning to this Thursday edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm one of your hosts today, Anthony Smith, and I'm joined by the one and only co-host here, Thomas Wasson.
They called me in and I answered the call indeed. Welcome to the Thursday show, of course. Among other things, we'll have On the Spot segment next hour with Tony Mulvey, and we'll talk with Lauren Beagen about yesterday's split between Maersk and MSC. But first, our top story returns us to the halls of Nikola, where the truck maker announced its use of hydrogen and started a fulfillment order for Anheuser-Busch.
We have our very own Alan Adler here this morning to jump into this. So Alan, just jumping into this topic, what are we looking at here at Nikola? It seems like they can't stay out of the news, but what do we have this time?
Well, this time I think they're happy to be in the news, honestly. A couple of developments yesterday. First was an announcement about 15 trucks, fuel cell trucks that are going to be delivered in the fourth quarter of this year to Beagen Brothers. They're a Napa, California-based logistics company. Been doing a lot of testing of Nikola vehicles over the years and pretty close partnership there. What was interesting was there was no mention yesterday, by the way, of Anheuser-Busch, except that we realized that if you pay attention, which I do actually pay attention. The Budweiser connection is that Biaggi is going to be driving these fuel cell trucks for Budweiser. Budweiser, way back in 2018, was the original fuel cell truck customer for Nikola. They have hung around, even though Nikola's had their share of ups and downs, and we've covered all of that. Budweiser has stuck around and is now starting to take delivery of what could be up to 800 fuel cell trucks over a number of years, but they'll get started with Biaggi doing the driving in the fourth quarter this year. So that was one thing. That was in the morning. Then in the afternoon, and I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, it could have been, but right at the time that Tesla, which used to be an obsession of founder Trevor Milton, truthfully, was reporting its earnings, Nikola decided it needed to do a press conference to announce the branding of its hydrogen as HYLA, H-Y-L-A. Now, what that stands for is the first two letters of hydrogen and the last two letters of Nikola. It also sounds suspiciously like Hyliion, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, the point being that there's enough of the hydrogen business now at Nikola that they have something they can brand, because they're working on distribution, they're working on acquiring hydrogen, and ultimately, providing it not just for their own trucks that are on the road, but for others too.
And are we thinking like hydrogen more as a stopgap or an actual, competing against battery electric trucks?
Thomas, I think they're going to be in concert. I don't think they're competitors. I think that, it's always been set up as it's either battery or hydrogen, and it's not. I mean, battery is great, and we're already seeing it for, pickup and delivery, short haul, repeatable routes where you can charge at night, things like that. But it takes so much battery power and weight, really, 10,000 pounds in the Nikola battery electric truck of batteries, that it's going to cut into your cargo capability. Your charging takes longer, things like that. If you're looking at long haul, now we've got some out there, and Volkswagen is one who believes that ultimately there'll be a battery breakthrough that will get you able to do long haul travel. But for right now, batteries are good for 200 to 300 miles. Hydrogen will get you 500 on a single fill, and that fill will be roughly the same time as it takes to fill with diesel. So they're separate approaches depending on use case. And I think what you're starting to see now is people are taking the long haul stuff seriously. Obviously, Anheuser-Busch has some routes they want to run from the Los Angeles area to Phoenix. Those were the original ones that were talked about, and that's largely what Biaggi, I think, is going to be doing for them. And then, we do have, obviously the Tesla Semi claims 500 miles. I think it probably can if you're loading it with something light and cubing it out as, potato chips. But if you're going to carry something heavier, maybe it doesn't get the full 500 miles. So a lot of that is yet to be determined. But I think we are looking at separate paths for energy.
And Alan, you mentioned earlier that HYLA branding. Of course, the first thing that came into my mind, and you mentioned it, Hyliion. Is there any correlation there? Any shots fired?
No. Well, except that someday Hyliion could be a customer for HYLA, if you think about it, because the way Thomas Healy looks at his business, I mean, the end game for him is to have a hydrogen-powered hybrid, basically. Today they run off natural gas, or they will be. They'll start with natural gas, and they have this sort of flux capacitor thing in the middle that they're, the technology they bought from General Electric, and we'll see what happens with that. But then ultimately, I think he expects their trucks to be, running on hydrogen, either a fuel cell or hydrogen fuel, in a combustion. So ultimately, I guess I'm going to reach out to him today to find out, honestly. But somebody on YouTube yesterday, where we were watching the press conference, commented that if they were Highland, they might be, not happy. So anyway, we'll see. But it is interesting, and I think it's significant. Okay, this is another one of these pins in the map of Highland's. Excuse me, did I say Highland? Nikola's journey that is significant in that, when you get around to branding something, you're pretty serious about it.
And thinking about it from a safety thing, every time I hear about hydrogen, unfortunately, I think of the Hindenburg and the humanity. National Institute of Highway Safety or other government organizations, have we decided to figure out what happens in the event an accident occurs with a hydrogen truck compared to a battery electric or internal combustion?
At this point, the testing, of the tanks, of the hydrogen tanks and things like that, and we've had most of the testing has been on cars to this point, because you do have some hydrogen fueled passenger vehicles out there, principally from Toyota, the Mirai. Basically, they have all the same safety standards. And, I worked in fuel cells at General Motors, and we went through this, that very question, continues to come up, and it's not, I don't know if it's irrelevant. It's just not as poignant as it once was, because hydrogen, when it vents, it goes straight up into the air. Now, it burns very hot, very white hot. You can't even see it. It's so hot. But it does escape straight up. It doesn't stick around on the ground at all. The safety issues around hydrogen, I think, have largely been resolved in terms of, carbon fiber tanks and things like that. It just, it's so rare. I guess anything can happen, but it's really not a day-to-day concern any longer.
And Alan, of course, you had one of your shows yesterday, but you have your truck tech coming out tomorrow. Any kind of sneak peek for what we can expect?
Well, a little more potpourri tomorrow. I'm struggling at this stage to come up with an essay. I may surprise myself, but there's a couple interesting things out there. One of them we mentioned on the show yesterday, which is also in the fuel cell space. PACCAR did some work with Toyota to put 10 T680 Class 8 trucks into use in the LA port area with fuel cells, and that program has pretty much run its course now. There's a second phase that is looking at maybe going across the Grapevine in California, going a little outside the ports. But what's interesting in the long game is something that Preston Fate, the CEO of PACCAR, mentioned this week, is that they are working on more of a truck solution with Toyota for a fuel cell. And of course, that is interesting because a couple of years ago, Toyota announced they were going to do a heavy-duty fuel cell stack and build them in Kentucky. So we may see, an early customer there for those in PACCAR. PACCAR is sure that everything is going to be clean diesel for quite a while, but they are into electric. They're into battery electrics as well as fuel cells, and placing small bets along the way, investing where they need to make sure they know what's going on. Same with autonomy over there.
And Alan, final thoughts here. We got about a minute and a half left. When we're talking about clean diesel and stuff, I remember the early 2000s, we heard about folks going to like Burger King's and McDonald's and reusing their oils and putting them in their trucks. Are we seeing any potential far out cool things like that, or have we all given up on trying to recycle Burger King grease?
No, I think, Thomas, I just saw something yesterday. I can't remember who it was that has gone to, it's not Burger King grease, but it is renewable diesel, which does come from beef talon and things like that. I think that, actually it doesn't. I'm not sure the exact makeup. It's not petroleum-based diesel, okay? And so renewable diesel is getting some attention out there, but mostly I think, when you talk about the, like the Diesel Technology Forum and those folks, they're looking at, kind of clean diesel where you're really down to that last, nth of a degree of pollutants that are coming out of there. They fight the good fight every day at the technology forum, trying to explain why diesel is not as bad as it might be. But when you get to absolutist positions like exist in California, where everything is electric or die, then you have a hard time, making your case, even if your performance, your environmental performance is pretty good. So, I do think there's roles for renewable diesel. I think there's certainly roles for the stuff we've been talking about on the electrification side. But you and I both know that we're going to be in the diesel business for a really long time.
Awesome. Alan, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We'll be sure to have you on again soon. I know it. And I can't wait to talk about what's going to happen in the upcoming Truck Tech.
Anthony, it's tomorrow.
I know. I can't wait.
Okay, I'll see you then. Take care. Thomas, good to see you then.
Pleasure, as always. I think we can do some renewables in terms of, how the cows produce methane through their farts. Well, if you can offset that with the biodiesel I make from eating them in their beef tallow, then the cow is full circle. I feel like I may have just sidestepped a few ideas. So, instead of all the methane in the capturing, which we're trying to make feeds for it, you could theoretically buy carbon credits. That's the only joke you get today, folks.
Needs to be in Davos. What are you doing here in Chattanooga? They needed you over there.
I lost my flight to Jackson Hole, and I ended up here somehow.
Right now, we're going to head over to the wall because we have our first carrier update of the morning.
Welcome into this carrier update. I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by Donnie Gilbert. Donnie, going to start you off. Something that I look at regularly, only because Michael on my team writes this, and we have discussions about the PPI every week. It's our FreightWaves Pricing Power Index.
Yeah, so basically what we're saying here is 50 is neutral. If it's above 50, it shows that carriers have the negotiating power to negotiating spot rates. When it drops below 50, it says that shippers have the negotiating strength. Or the markets are more controlled by shippers now that it's below 50. And if it was above 50, it'd be the carriers controlling the markets. Well, we're at 35. We've been below 50 for quite some time. Yeah. And we're going to go through some other indexes today that kind of shows you what's going on. But it's very strong right now on the shippers' side of shippers controlling the markets. What would it take to flip this? It's going to take a lot. It's a lot easier to go in the bad direction than it is the good direction. So a lot of capacity has to dry up. Whether freight, not inventories, whether the freight volumes pick up or not, we still need the capacity to dry up. So if they don't pick up, obviously more capacity has to leave the markets. But if we can get capacity to shrinking up, then we see the spot rates start to tilt. Maybe we'll start seeing more imports coming in from China or other parts. A lot of things start to need to kind of happen all together to get these freight volumes back up and to get carriers back in control.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's not one index, I guess, if you want to think of it that way, isn't going to drive pricing power completely back to the carriers or really even move this much higher. I mean, this is... Even in an environment we're in right now, right? We've talked about it. Volume levels are stronger than maybe what we thought they were going to be in January, but you look at rejections, they're trending slightly. I mean, they're basically flatlining. Spot rates are trending lower. Contract rates have come down. That gap's narrowed, but contract rates have to continue to decline to narrow that gap, and we'll talk about that a little later. But I mean, there's not one index that's showing that this is shifting back into the carrier's favor.
Yeah, like I say, to reshift this, getting it to go back up, we're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 things happen together.
Yep.
And that will start to push up. And those are different indexes that we can watch here in Sonar. So keep an eye, one number on the PPI, keep an eye on Container Atlas, keep an eye on volumes and the changes in volumes. Just because we see volumes maybe not shifting that much, go to your weekly changes and see maybe they're starting to pick up here. And if you start seeing it pick up in border cities or maybe like LAX on the West Coast, then you can say, hey, we're starting to see more of an influx of imports or something starting to move here. There's a lot of inventory and stuff in warehouses. So we may not exactly see imports pick up back first, Tony. We may start seeing a lot of shipping happen, volumes start picking up, it being mid-haul, short-haul, et cetera, and those goods start moving out of warehouses. And then once those get to susceptible levels, then we start reordering from other countries, not just China, but other countries as well. And then we'll start seeing those bookings start to pick up, or the TEU volumes pick up. So there's a lot that you can kind of keep an eye on and watch and try to help see this happening 30, 45, 65 days in advance.
Yeah, I mean, this, obviously, it's broken out shipper carrier, but it is a supply chain pricing power index, right? We're looking at it's a holistic view from kind of 20,000 feet. What's going on in the ocean? What's going on the rails and things like that to produce this number to really show who does have some of that pricing power.
When we come back, we're going to look at some LMI indexes, and we'll see what these guys, boots on the ground, I call them, what they see going on, and see how it compares to what you're showing here with the PPI.
Absolutely. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for this update. We'll be sure to check in with you again a little later. Right now, we'll hand it back over to Thomas Wasson.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Thomas Wasson, and it's time to read the news. FreightWaves, a digital freight marketplace that instantly connects ocean, air, and truck carriers with shippers, will be publicly listed on the NASDAQ exchange Thursday after combining with a blank check company to raise $80 million, taking a route less traveled since the SPAC market fell out of favor. FreightWaves, which we listed under the ticket CRGO, agreed last May to merge with shell company Gersher Acquisition Group. The Securities and Exchange Commission recently completed its review of the deal, paving the way for the initial public offering. How will the split between Maersk and MSC change the maritime shipping landscape? Greg Miller finds out. He jumps into this question reporting that MSC might be big enough to stand alone in the market, while Maersk, currently the number 2 maritime carrier in the world, might need to align with someone else to keep pace. Miller also notes that alliances often face pressure when things are good, as maritime shipping saw a boom over the course of the pandemic. Now, you can read more of his analysis on FreightWaves.com. And last but not least, a survey of nearly 1,000 drivers by driver mobility provider TruckerPath asked a simple question: how frequently would you like to return home from the road? If the results are any indication, carriers appear to do a good job of responding to their drivers' preferences. The survey, published Wednesday, said that 63% of drivers who preferred to return home every night were allowed to do so. About 89% of drivers who wanted to return home several times a month had their request granted. Roughly 80% of the drivers who preferred to always be on the road were given that privilege, according to the survey. And about 74% of drivers who wanted to be home several times a week were allowed to do so. That's pretty good odds, folks, but you can find these details and more at FreightWaves.com and on the FreightWaves app. And if you're watching live, folks, or on our YouTube channel, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. For the full FreightWaves TV experience, head over to tv.freightwaves.com. Now, we're going to toss it over to a quick break, but do not fret, dear listener. We will return with more content.
The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest Freight Tech news at FreightWaves.com.
Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston. Drilling Deep is the place where we talk about oil and we talk about diesel, and you have to drill to get oil and you have to get oil to make diesel, so that's why we call it Drilling Deep. Drilling Deep drops every Friday on FreightWaves TV and all available podcast platforms.
Welcome back to FreightWaves Now, everyone. I'm Isaiah Buchanan, and this is Social Roundabout, where we take a look at what's trending on social media. Well, scrolling through my favorite app yesterday, Twitter, I found a couple of very interesting videos. Ones that'll make you kind of just scratch your head and be like, what is wrong with humanity? Take a look at this first video of a woman who was using gas to wash her car.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so you go in and tell. Yeah, somebody should go in and tell somebody.
I have to go tell. She's doing her whole car. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
It looks like a scene out of Zoolander. I mean, what? She had to know that that was gasoline, right, and not water. Like, I just have so many questions about this because she looks so confident in spraying this gas all over her car. And, I mean, she's even rubbing it in. Like, I mean, I don't know, people. I mean, it makes you wonder what is wrong with humanity. Switching things up a little bit, I have another interesting video. We've seen basketball games get stopped for all sorts of reasons. You know, maybe the lights go out or somehow a squirrel or other animal gets on the court, but never for a delivery driver or a delivery food, like DoorDash delivery driver, dropping off food and standing on the court in the middle of the game. Take a look at this video.
Saw the stoppage. The man was usher. Let's see if we can see this. No, this is going to be the turnover in the
There he is, right there in the corner. Yay.
So this guy's actually, who's he delivering it to?
The ref. The ref
official?
said later. Give it to me later.
Dude had to know what he was doing. You could see him look at the players on the court, and he just continued to walk onto the court. They ended up having to pause the game. Apparently somebody from the video board ordered food. He was able to actually get the food after the pause of the game. So, you know, hopefully he gave that delivery driver a huge tip for all of his troubles. That's all I have for this edition of the Social Roundabout. Right now I'm going to toss things over to Anthony and Thomas.
I like the gas car. When NASCAR is not good enough, you can always count on gas car to help out with your needs. She probably got really high off of the fumes and midway through the plan realized, I'm feeling pretty good. This is some great soapy water.
It kind of reminded me of like the wrong version of that Mad Max scene where they were spitting fuel into the engine. But I don't think that's going to get the same result here.
She was witness, that's for sure.
Right now, we're going to welcome on our next guest, and we have the very one and only Dr. Andrew Balthrop here to join us this morning to talk about what's going on in manufacturing distribution. Dr. Andrew Balthrop, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So just jumping straight into it, what are we seeing with manufacturing distribution, and is there any long-term or stable growth potential here?
What's been on my mind, and I think what's been on a lot of the media recently, has been sort of the transfer of manufacturing from China over to Mexico, the nearshoring trend, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about this morning. Is this nearshoring trend something that's going to continue to be a trend going forward? Is it something that's it's just a product of COVID? This is something that I think is the big thing that people have to understand in deciding, where to locate their manufacturing and how to organize their distributional networks.
And I think that's a really great point. People are sleeping on the fact that right now Mexican labor not only is skilled, but also cheaper than Chinese labor. And, the pandemic trend, it feels like, do you think that we're going to see a significant expansion and maybe change of the makeup of the Mexican workforce? Or what kind of things are you noticing in the research or, when speaking to people that we're starting to see with these nearshoring efforts?
I think you have to look at the long-term trends here. And Thomas, I think you're exactly right, is that when we look at the long-term trends about why companies had located manufacturing to China to begin with, it had, two big advantages. And one of them was that it was cheap to produce there. The cost of labor was low, going back to the 1990s, for example. And then the other thing was that you had very small world, I guess, right? A very stable logistics system for a long time that made the world seem small. Both of those things are no longer the case. The first thing you had, as you mentioned, is that China has developed over the past 30 years, and that their labor costs aren't as low as they used to be, right? And that I've seen those same statistics that Mexican labor costs on average are a bit lower. Now, China still has, a huge amount of capacity that, just the size of the Chinese economy is always going to make them a player. But if you talk about the relative costs now, right, is that Mexico looks a lot better than before. Then the other thing is, and your viewers will know this, right, is that since COVID and all the logistical disruptions that we've had, is that being far away has been really detrimental. That these long lead times from China, measured in months, have caused all kinds of issues and have made it very difficult for companies to get their product.
And Dr. Balthrop, when we're looking at the ongoing development in Mexico and, of course, current situations in China, one of the things that's been on top of my mind is, do we see China just start to invest in Mexico and make sure that they still have some type of association with the current growth there, and make sure that they're still kind of involved in any kind of nearshoring or reshoring efforts?
Well, I think China's perspective is going to be, different than the U.S. perspective here, right? Is that one of the big problems that Mexico solves for the U.S., is that logistical problem. Is that instead of taking months to get product from a facility in China, you can measure it in days. From Mexico, it's much easier to control operations in Mexico. Businesses based in the U.S. can easily send executives, same day. That the cultures are more aligned, right? Is that there's more cross-cultural understanding, both politically, and culturally between the U.S. and Mexico, that make it a bit easier. From the Chinese perspective, I don't think Mexico makes nearly as much sense, right? As it doesn't offer them the logistical advantages as before, and there's plenty of other developing economies around China if they wanted to locate manufacturing somewhere else.
I think it's impressive, especially choosing Mexico, that in spite of the fact that most of the northern border provinces in Mexico are having trouble with central government, with cartels running rampant, it still is a more attractive thing to, ship it in. I spoke with a forwarder that actually talked about how Chinese multinationals and American corporations, they would ship the goods from China to one of the Mexican ports on the West Coast and then pipe them over to the distribution hubs in Mexico, then send them back up the border. And in terms of cost, certain items, it was very fascinating. Looking long term, from an academic standpoint, is there anything that we should be watching to get an idea of, how much more of this movement's happening? Are we seeing more of this nearshoring, or is there more research that you would like to look into to see, how to better understand this phenomenon?
I think the research trend is that researchers since COVID have taken supply chain issues much, much more seriously than before. You can see this, I'm sure Anthony has, in the leading economics journal, is that there's much more focus on logistics than you would have seen, say in 2019. When people talk about the cost of production, is that beforehand is that it was only the cost of production, is that nobody looked at the cost of transportation, right, or the cost of holding inventory, or the long lead times that make it more difficult to control. And so, you can ignore these logistics costs when you have a very stable, predictable world, and so it's okay to have those long supply chains. And the supply chains in China were very efficient, but when you have those disruptions, all that goes out the window, and the cost advantages that had been dwindling in China, as you said, right, is that if you look at the labor costs between China and Mexico, they go away completely. What I kind of wonder about, and this is the question I guess everybody is trying to answer, is, what are the trends going forward? It's always easy to react to the last crisis. And so when you had this unpredictable demand and you had these supply disruptions, China really didn't work. Well, I think and I hope we're going to kind of a more stable world. And so you kind of would like to see companies, the nearshoring, it's not an all or nothing kind of proposition. It's more of a, putting a little bit of eggs in more baskets, right? So you're not completely beholden to these long supply chains, but you are getting some of that capacity and efficiency. On the other side, you are getting that insurance, right, to protect you against disruptions.
And one more follow-up question on that. I asked Dr. Carell this as well, researcher at MIT. If you had a wish list of either a partnership or a data set or something that you would like some folks to reach out so you can work on, what would it be?
We could be here a long time talking about data like that. I think in the data space now, it's all about matching things up, and so this is what makes FreightWaves, a powerful tool about matching up manufacturing data to logistical data and so on, right? To get the whole picture, is that when we're talking about the full cost of production, is that it's easy, just to go to these disconnected sources and see only a slice of it, right? The data gets more powerful the more connected it is. So I'd want it all.
And Dr. Balthrop, if someone had it all and they want to get in touch with you or just want to continue this conversation or find out more about what you do, how can they reach out to you?
I'm in the Supply Chain Management Research Center here at the University of Arkansas, and if you Google that, you'll find me right quick.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Balthrop, thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure having you on, always insightful.
Thank you guys very much.
And I think there's just so much going on in this world of nearshoring and reshoring, and I think we'll probably get a lot more of a deeper dive into this in our next virtual event.
I think so, and I think visibility as well. One thing that a few folks are working on, it's literally called a digital duplicate or a digital of the supply chain, almost like a holographic representation of it. And the problem was, just like he was saying, data, and it's so hard to find it. So speaking of finding the data, we're having an upcoming Global Supply Chain Week that folks can be checking out.
That's right, and we're going to take a short break, but during that break, you can get registered for this in the meantime.
Exactly. Push that like and subscribe and sign up, folks.
like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
Hey everybody, this is Thomas Wasson, enterprise trucking carrier expert here at FreightWaves, telling you about my show, Loaded and Rolling. Now, it involves trucking topics for large carriers and even small ones that wish to be large. Anything that impacts trucking, you can get it there. You can catch us every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern on tv.freightwaves.com. We do it live.
Hello and welcome back to this Thursday edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Anthony Smith here with the co-host as well, Thomas Wasson. And he's not just a co-host, he has his own segment right now. And we're talking about Loaded and Rolling. Thomas, you host this show. And it's also a newsletter. What time does it come out?
So it's normally coming out Tuesdays and Thursdays, actually, 2:30 to 3. I had my audience, this is what was bad. It used to be like Wednesday nights and then like Saturday mornings. And so thank you to the Loaded and Rolling community who read it anytime it gets sent out. It normally will take like 24 hours to find out because people are at work or, they're checking their emails. So, but you can find it, of course. We'll plug it at the end. You can just do like Loaded and Rolling FreightWaves and it'll pop up and just press subscribe. And at the same time, like also fill in for SiriusXM for Grace. So a lot of fun stuff going on this week. I actually did 3 shows, Friday, Monday, and Tuesday. Boy, are my legs tired. I'm just kidding. But it was a great opportunity because like we were talking to guests earlier, some of the folks are trying to answer the same question. How do I see what's going on to fix what is already messed up?
Right, and I mean, this goes kind of into our last conversation with Dr. Balthrop of looking at the data, interpreting the data, and sometimes when I'm hearing, we had conversations about this earlier in the week, especially with Metaphor, around the right data and what is good data, what is actionable data, because there's so much data out there, but it could just be old and not useful or you're not using it correctly. Yeah, and one problem you run into with that data, making a decision, you run into what's called analysis paralysis, where imagine every time I go to Taco Bell, there's like 15 combos, and studies show like they did this with peppers. They had like 50 different jars of peppers to try, and then they had another table that had 5 jars of peppers. And the thing they realized was when individuals would come up and they would be overwhelmed with choices and data, they would simply freeze up, or they would just pick a random one and be like, you know what, close enough, folks. Mm-hmm. And so for folks in corporations and even trucking companies, that becomes really, really challenging. I had on Josh Smith, recently promoted to VP of OTR and Variant. And one interesting factor with them is, how do you interpret the data and how do you use that data to improve the quality of life for people and drivers? And we got on a little bit of a tangent about trailer pools. It's a very special topic of mine, if you don't know. Trailer utilization is the roadie to the rock show of trucking. Everyone talks about the drivers. They forget the things they're hauling. So, one thing US Express does, and I've had experience working there, is using analytics and telematics like Skybits and stuff to find out where the trailers are they empty, and then making the data-driven decisions to find out which customers. Oftentimes, large carriers, publicly traded, they won't tell you because they may get in trouble, but if you can catch the inventory levels based on how many times they hoard your trailers. So I knew when the market was getting soft and I managed a market, I could tell because they either didn't have enough labor, so they would not unload my trailers, and that was the conversation. Or, like right now, we have too much inventory. They can't fill up their warehouse, so they use the trailer because, I may only charge you like 15 or 30 bucks a day. If I manage to get around to that, by the way, it's really hard hitting people up for trailers because the customer gets pissed. And in this environment, they'll say, well, I'll just go somewhere else. And then you have these awkward conversations. But that was a fascinating talk because from a driver experience standpoint, one thing that pisses off drivers more than anything, and I've had to do it a few times, is sending them to trailer parts and there's no trailer. So you're like, oh yeah, go to this one. And so they'll spend 3 or 4 hours of their day. Wow. It's a fun thing by George Ritzer called The McDonaldization of Society. It talks about, he's a sociologist, the irrationality of rationalization. And when we talk about that, you wonder why an interstate system is designed to be a rationalized system to go faster, but it in fact goes slower. Well, the same thing happens for drop and hook trailer pools. It's supposed to be faster, 45 minutes in and out, drop and hook, or preload pickup. Well, what happens is because of customers and other factors,
It then turns into a 3-hour ordeal, and you could have just had the trailer unloaded in a perfect world scenario. So, these are challenges that carriers are facing, and it's kind of one of those things that you don't really hear a lot about because the more glamorous things are, revenue per truck per week, revenue miles, driver turnover, EBITDA, and all the other fun stuff. But behind the scenes, pull the curtain back, folks. The cesspool of finding trailers is truly challenging.
So we're looking at this shortage here. I know all the time in the supply chain, we have almost like that Spider-Man meme, everyone pointing at each other. with this situation, where does the onus really fall on?
Well, it's fascinating because it normally will fall on shipper characteristics. Is the shipper internally, and you'll find out which shippers in large, in a customer mix of Fortune 100s, you'll know really quick if they're doing well as a carrier because they're not unloading their crap. And so that's like, you can find out how well a Procter & Gamble, a Home Depot, a Tractor Supply, a Goodyear Tire is doing based on, or an automotive. You'll find out really quick for folks in the automotive space if Ford or Claycomo or GM or one of the locations in Louisville or Detroit is having issues or delays because they'll also not do return rack loads. A lot of times in automotive, you're shipping raw materials and then they're gonna ship back the racks to the other processing place. And if they don't have enough return rack loads or they have too many return rack loads, it's a really fascinating thing. And then they start screaming at you because automotive is really tough. I talked to a guy on Sirius from Circle Logistics and he does just-in-time automotive. And I asked him, have you ever shut down a plant before? He's like, no, thankfully I haven't. And I was like, brother, I have. And it's about $100,000 to $500,000 an hour and they'll bill you back. It wasn't my fault though, so don't worry. It's someone else's fault. But, those are some of the challenges in the supply chain that we don't see. When we're looking at data, you have to be very careful because you also want to be like a detective. Right. If I'm looking at speeding up a truckload network, am I going to look at the average dwell time on the tractor, or am I going to look at trailer turns at a location? Am I going to look at the equipment positioned within this network? You'll find really quickly that mismatching of equipment at locations will actually slow down the entire thing. It's like it almost has properties of hydrology in terms of the flow of inbound, outbound units. And so those are some really fascinating things that you get to dive into when you're designing it. But if you get the wrong data or it's incorrect, luckily telematics are getting a lot better, so you can find that out. But that's where you get a trucking company that's an 85% operating ratio or a 95. That's the 10% that separates it. How well are you identifying these problems, communicating them to the stakeholders, which usually involves customer service as well as outside sales, finding a solution for it as well as pricing. If I know that this customer is the bottleneck of the Cincinnati area, then I may need to do my RFPs. But how well do you communicate on the RFPs? Is your pricing team unified in what they need to be working on? A lot of times it's overwhelming. Johnson Controls, before they got bought out by whatever the company, they would send like 10,000 lanes, OD pairs, and you have an analyst looking at it. So looking at things like Emerge and other companies are trying to tackle this complexity, there's a lot more we can still work on because it is Heartland was always a great example. Like when I worked at Large Trucking, we're like, dang, I wish we could price as well as Heartland. Well, Heartland had, structures in place that said, I will do this. And so final fun thought, by the way, I actually got to host a webinar. One of the reasons parcel carriers are getting disrupted like FedEx and UPS is they're so good at that. UPS and FedEx will say, I will go this way, but if I need to go to Butte, Montana, I'm going to charge you like 50 extra bucks. Right. Death by 1,000 fees. And so just like with trucking, we're now seeing an opportunity for disruptors to come up the value chain and use technology and say, okay, well, this one was smart cargo. Like I'm going to put it under a Delta plane, a Delta passenger plane, not a cargo plane. And we're just going to say, well, I've got a flight coming out of CHA to Butte. I've got a bunch of extra space because maybe we're only at like 75% occupancy. I'm going to put some parcels on there, send it all the way up, and it costs about the same, but it arrives there within hours. And so there's a lot of cool stuff on the horizon, but like circling back to data, the biggest challenge, and this has been a revolution in the past 4 years, is companies are finally thinking to themselves, hey, I can use data and it can also help me. Traditionally trucking, you don't want to share data because if you're failing to pick the load up and they see it, they're going to get mad. And brokers were the same way. Oh, carrier fell off. Now I'm hitting the phones. We're finally getting to a point culturally where all these stakeholders are finally begrudgingly willing to share. But at the same time, you get the Sunday scaries. Are they going to know my margin per load? Are they going to know my internal neural network? Can they backdoor me? So we got a ways to go, but it's so fascinating right now. We're in the very early stages of watching this data revolution. And like you said, we're finally agreeing upon what we should look at and what we should share versus none at all.
Exactly right. And Thomas, real quick, one more time, when does Load and Rolling come out?
Yeah, check out the TV show as well, live Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern or 10 a.m. Pacific for those of you cats on the West Coast, as well as the newsletter Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:30 p.m. Check it out, tv.freightwaves.com, Loaded and Rolling. Just press shows. It's purple. It's got trucks on it. Newsletter looks the same. freightwaves.com/loaded and rolling. Check it out.
Always fun and entertaining and insightful as well. Keeping that insight going on, we're going to head over to the wall because we have our next carrier update.
Welcome into this carrier update, Donnie. We're going to talk LMI, Logistics Managers Index, as you referred to, those boots on the ground, based on a survey that goes out to logistics managers across the country, and basically aggregates it and comes up with an index. Anything above 50 is expansion, anything below 50, contraction. First one we're going to look at, that sub-index, is transportation prices.
Yeah, and here we see it's at 36.9. Here's 50. Back in end of June, that's where we crossed down below 50. And that's when we started seeing that dip. Now, this is a survey. Why I love the LMI is this survey is very, very accurate. You get a lot of good information out of the survey by just seeing what these guys that are working in the warehouses, working in the offices, booking these trucks, loading and unloading trucks, what they see. And they know what is going on besides the CEO, CFO, COO. They have a lot more information because they are what I say, the boots on the ground. So here we see it at 36.90. Again, this backs up of why your PPI is at 35.
Yeah.
Why we see a big decline in spot rates. Everybody's seeing it. And this could be one of the indicators. If you see this start to turn around, now, if it goes from 36 to 46, what they're saying is it's still contracting, just at a slower rate. So we will need this to get back above 50 before this shows anything of any signs of turnaround. But it's still a good index to one of those to keep an eye on. If you see it start to turn back up, start taking a watch to different markets, it could be a turnaround.
Yeah, I mean, an example of that 36 to 46, right? Rates go from $2 to $1.50, and then the next month they're $1.50 to $1.40, right? So where you've lost, what, 20%?
Yeah.
Or 25%? Well, then the next month's decline was only
a few percentage points.
Yeah, so they're still on the way down, it's just not there. So, I mean, when you saw it flip, right, or invert from that expansionary, I mean, spot rates were still, or not even spot rates, contract rates were still going up in May, but they were going up at a slower rate than what they were in March and April, which is no surprise when you look at OTVI, OTRA, all those measure indexes as well. When they started to slow down, this started to flip. So that'll be an interesting thing, like you said, to pay attention to when this does change, right? So
yeah, it's one of those key indicators of what I've been talking about. What are we looking for? What are our first signs going to be that things are not slowing down anymore, or starting to stabilize, or starting to speed back up some? And that's like, again, bookings coming from imports, TEU volume on the ocean, your LMI indexes, and then of course volumes and rejection rates for the loads that are going on here. We want to keep, and start, way as far out as possible, which we can see, 35 to 60 days in advance of what's coming across the ponds. And here we see what managers are looking at in their warehouses, in their logistics companies, and what they're seeing. And it'll all start to come together. It's almost, like pallet production. Pallet production is going to start picking back up. Why? You need more pallets because you're shipping more goods. So watch those volumes. Next one here real quick. Inventory levels. Well, this one's kind of almost disappointing, but we see inventory levels through the end of the year they were still growing. It never got below 50. And that's a problem that we've been talking about. Warehouses are full. Warehouse capacity is very, very tight. And then here we go back up to 57. So there's still increasing at a slow pace, not like we were back here in February, where here we were at 80.
But yeah,
But
still up.
they need to be at like 44.
Yeah.
And starting to show that we're buying that inventory and that, as long as we're growing here, we're not going to be doing the orders. Things are going to be packing up and stocking up in warehouses.
Absolutely. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for this update. Right now, we'll take a quick break, but we'll be back with more FreightWaves Now.
Welcome back to another edition of Check Call, Check Call, Check Call, Check Call. Let's go. Nobody works for free, so why should we be expecting our drivers to? Okay, let's just get it together now. What are some of those proactive steps that you can start taking now? For myself, I would like the Earth to still be here for a little bit longer, but is a hot dog a sandwich?
Oh, okay. Is pizza an open-faced sandwich? It's bread.
I have been ready for this question. I've seen the show.
We're all in this together.
Thanks for making me hungry. Now I want a hot dog.
You're welcome. Catch episodes of Check Call Tuesdays at 12:30 on FreightWaves TV. Keep up with all things Check Call on freightwaves.com/checkcall. See you on the internet.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation. This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
Welcome back to FreightWaves Now, everyone. I'm Isaiah Buchanan, and this is Social Roundabout. Now, I want to point this out before I get started talking about anything. Today is the 3-year anniversary since Kobe Bean Bryant passed away in a helicopter crash with his daughter and several other people. So rest in peace to Kobe, one of the greatest basketball players to ever do it. Now, getting into our first heartwarming story in this Social Roundabout segment, a Delta flight attendant has gone viral after a picture of him on social media shows him comforting a passenger who was very nervous, has a fear of flying. So this man's name is Floyd Dean Shannon. He has been a flight attendant for only about 3 months. The passenger was super nervous. He said that she even started sweating before the takeoff happened. But once they were in the air, he walked over to her and he took her by the hand and was just sitting there talking to her, explaining everything, all the sounds, the turbulence that he was hearing to help calm her down. Another one of the passengers caught this moment on camera and put it on social media. It has gone viral. Dean Shannon said that I'm here to give love to everybody. I love to share the love. So Floyd Dean Shannon, congratulations to you, man. Keep doing your job the way that you are because you are amazing at it. And now I want to talk about Netflix. They are going to be ending their password sharing sometime later in the first quarter, probably around the end of March, early April. They made an announcement last year talking about how they were going to potentially get rid of password sharing. That was in October of last year. And now they have made that announcement saying that it will happen later in this first quarter. Now, they are planning on doing this, like I said, later in the first quarter. There's still no specific date, but like I said, later in the first quarter. Netflix says that password sharing happens in over 100 million homes, and it hurts their ability to be able to invest and improve. So Netflix, if you're sharing somebody's password, I hope you can be able to get your own account. They did say that they are going to make it a little bit easier for people who have accounts on other profiles to be able to switch them over to their own profile. Just another way to make it easier for you to make your own profile and for them to get your money. That's all I have for this edition of the Social Roundabout, but right now I'm gonna toss things over to Thomas and Anthony.
I have a few Netflix passwords out there.
I have a little family sharing, but in true Netflix fashion, it didn't survive past the 3rd season. So there goes the passwords as well. I always feel like with Netflix, their algorithm's a little too good, except they forget the long tail of content distribution, and so half the time they treat it like a VC. So a lot of good shows that I personally enjoyed have been axed. So I say to Netflix, focus less on the passwords, my friend. Focus more on figuring out your content cycle, because right now it's like an episode of Old Yeller every time I get attached to a show, and it gets 2 seasons, and I'm literally wondering, you can't run a business model with me hoping that the show survives, and you can't run a business model with making your consumers continuously try and lobby you to bring it back.
I think that's very well put. I mean, there's just so many shows that are like got a lot of momentum, and then they just kill it off and then disperse into other venues and venues. Right?
But one thing we're not killing off is Global Supply Chain Week, which is coming up here. It's going to make it a lot more season, and it'll be a little more entertaining. No password sharing required at this thing, folks. February 20th through the 24th, virtual. Am I right?
That's right, and it is something that you do have to register for, and there's going to be a giveaway every single day, so there is something there for you, and there's going to be great networking, something that you also can't do on Netflix as easily. So this is going to be an event that you don't want to miss. Get networking, get out there, get registered, get those free potential gifts and giveaways that can come to your doorstep. But right now, we're going to take a look at what's happened in the last 24 hours of freight and a short break. We'll be right back with more FreightWaves Now.
Like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
Welcome back to the second hour of FreightWaves Now. I'm Thomas Wasson, and it's time to read the news. More news. How will the split between Maersk and MSC change the maritime shipping landscape? Greg Miller jumps into this question on FreightWaves.com, reporting that MSC might be big enough to stand alone in the market, while Maersk, currently number 2 maritime carrier in the world, might need to align with someone else to keep pace. Miller also notes that alliances often face pressure when things are good, as maritime shipping saw a boom over the course of the pandemic. And a survey of nearly 1,000 drivers by driver mobility provider TruckerPath asked a simple question: how frequently would you like to return home from the road? If the results are any indication, carriers appear to do a good job of responding to their drivers' preferences. The survey, published Wednesday, said that 63% of drivers who preferred to return home every night were allowed to do so. About 89% of drivers who wanted to return home several times a month had their request granted. And roughly 80% of the drivers who preferred to always be on the road were given that privilege, according to the survey. And finally, more facts: 74% of drivers who wanted to be home several times a week were allowed to do so. The next one, Covenant Logistics Group highlighted several achievements during 2022, including generating more than $1 billion in freight revenue and achieving an all-time high for full-year earnings per share in the fourth quarter report published Wednesday after the market closed. Holy run-on sentence, Batman. However, it also appears that the current overhang on freight markets lingering for a while. David Parker, chairman and CEO, stated in a news release, "While we anticipate improved equipment-related costs in 2023, we believe the freight market, as a combination of freight rates and volumes, will remain unfavorable compared to the prior year for the next several quarters." Now, Covenant reported adjusted earnings per share of $1.37 in the quarter, 5 cents shy of the consensus estimate, according to Seeking Alpha. And Nikola Corp is sending 15 hydrogen-powered fuel cell trucks to California in the fourth quarter. It's the first step in fulfilling Anheuser-Busch InBev's long-standing order for up to 800 of the zero-emission vehicles. Separately, the startup electric truck maker also announced Hyla, Hyla, a new brand covering its hydrogen production, distribution, and dispensing business. It plans 60 stations by 2026. Hyla combines the first 2 letters of hydrogen with the last 2 letters of Nikola. And in other news, Hapag Lloyd on Wednesday signed a binding agreement to acquire a 35% stake in JM Baxi Ports and Logistics Limited, a private terminal and inland transport service provider in India. The seller is a Bain Capital private equity affiliate, Hapag Lloyd said. Terms of the transaction were not disclosed. Hapag Lloyd said JMBPL's operations include container terminals, a multi-purpose terminal, inland container depots, container freight stations, and logistics offerings such as rail services, not including a partridge in a pear tree. The company employs about 5,400 people and handles about 1.6 million 20-foot equivalent units annually. That's TEUs for those who don't know. You can find details of these stories and more on FreightWaves.com and on the FreightWaves app. And those of you watching on your YouTube channel, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. For the full FreightWaves TV experience, head on over to tv.freightwaves.com. That's it for the news, though. We're going to toss it over to Tony for our next carrier update.
Welcome into this carrier update. And Donnie, we're going to start here with a chart or a map that we've talked about, I don't know, once every few weeks. It's our outbound tender market share, but the yearly change. So you're able to see what markets are growing and shrinking relative to the rest of the markets, because obviously volume levels have been on the decline, and that's pretty broad across the country. If we just looked at OTVIY, it'd be a lot of red.
OTVIY actually would be very close to this exact map. Except the difference is when we use OTVI, we use an index number. And you add up all 135 markets and you see that 10,350 that we see on OTVI.USA. What we've done here is we've taken that 10,350 and we've made it to a percentage where all these add up to 100%. So when you do that, what you see is if one market increases, another market must decrease. So when we look at this 1 year change, we're comparing January to January of last year. and we see what we call emerging markets, markets that are growing. So here we see Phoenix, Arizona, a darker blue. Well, that could be the California exodus of some shippers or whatnot. It could be other things. But you see there's more outbound freight right now in Phoenix than there was this time last year. There's less in Southern California. LAX here, very small decrease. But when you look at a very small percentage decrease of a market that's one of the biggest markets in the U.S., that adds up to be a lot of freight. Again, look out here. We see Houston a darker blue. Now, did this grow because we have more freight going out or because other markets shrink? That can also happen. Now, what I like about this map, this is a great map for salespeople. Now, and this is why. Let's say you operate out of Houston. You've operated out of Houston for the last 5 years. All of a sudden this year, you see it's a whole lot busier. Like you can maybe push your rates up some. Why? Because there's more freight. And maybe there's not as many, there's the same number of trucks, but there's more freight. Therefore, capacity is tighter. The reverse for maybe Indianapolis. You've been operating out of Indianapolis for 5 years. The same number of trucks you're operating in Indianapolis, yet there's less freight. So now you have to drop your prices to go in and get that freight. Well, if you're a salesperson, you can say, hey, look, the Greenville, South Carolina market, the Nashville market, these are markets that we can grow because they're blue. These are where I need to start making my phone calls and try to move some of your trucks that we're picking up and operating in the red and switch them over to some of these blues, and you might do better with your rates.
Yeah, and I think a great example, you almost can see the shift in imports from West Coast to East Coast, right? Look at LA, look at San Francisco, but Port of Oakland's included in there. Those are two that have lost market share over the past year. You look at a Houston, a Savannah, a Baltimore. I mean, you're seeing this, you can see the shift of, we've talked about it, but now you're putting it to actual outbound volumes on the truck side, not just the import side. So it gives you a way to kind of see these changes as they happen, but over the course of a full year instead of just necessarily a short-term blip.
And this is about date to date, Tony. So you need to check this. I would check this weekly because as we get into February and things, like I say, normally freight volumes in January start high, end low. In February, they start low and end a little bit higher than March, back high to low. So this is always changing. So at least once a week, you should be checking in on this and seeing if other markets change. You might find shifts that you can't really pick up on or see ordinarily.
Absolutely. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for this update. We'll be sure to check in with you again a little later. Right now, we'll hand it back over to Thomas and Anthony.
Guys, thanks so much for that update. We'll be sure to check with you a little bit later on. Right now, we're welcoming on our next guest, and we have the one and only Lauren Beagen, the maritime professor. Lauren, thanks so much for being here this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Great to have you as always. And Lauren, you just had the headlines, and I hear there's a little bit of a split happening in the industry. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's appropriate that we're getting close to Valentine's Day, right? There's a breakup out there. So the 2M Alliance, Maersk and MSC, they have filed their divorce papers.
Do they get 2 Christmases, though? That's my important question.
I guess we'll find out. Well, for the next 2 years, maybe they're going to figure it out. So what is an alliance, right? That's probably a good place to start. So Maersk and MSC joined together in a vessel sharing agreement, is what this essentially is. So they're vessel pooling arrangements. They're able to kind of charter and exchange space on one another's vessels. We've seen this a lot in the airlines. That's probably what people are most familiar with. If you want to hop on a flight and go over to Denver, because of airline alliances, you don't have to stop over in Kansas City. However, if you're on Southwest, you might have to because they're not part of an airline alliance. That same type of mentality applies to ocean shipping. You might be able to get a service straight from Vietnam to wherever your port of import is because it's available through the larger use of this pooling of ships. Some things to note, though, these are not rate-setting clubs. These aren't conferences. They can't control each other's rates. They can't actually talk about each other's rates. It was simply supposed to be a way to increase the operational efficiency and really service for shippers so that they had more options out there in the ocean shipping world.
That seems interesting. It reminds me of interchange agreements with motor carriers and shippers where they'll sometimes use it. Amazon's notorious, by the way. You make a deal with them, they'll use your trailer and anyone else's, and they won't tell you. It's horrible. But looking at it from a carrier standpoint, you know, rates were really well. The situation was great. Why would you suddenly want to call it quits when things get a little choppy in the water, so to speak?
Well, so this might have been planned for a while, actually. So when agreements are filed with the Federal Maritime Commission, so the Federal Maritime Commission is the agency, the independent regulatory agency of the United States that receives these agreement filings. And so when they filed this agreement, they actually had a clause in there that said not sooner than 8 years from the beginning of this agreement. And I haven't seen a lot of people talking about that, but it makes it so that it's not surprising that it happened now. The agreement was filed in 2014. 8 years was 2022. Here we are, the first month of 2023. They're allowed to dissociate from this agreement under their own terms of the agreement. So it makes sense that 2023, the first opportunity for them to do that. MSC has now overtaken Maersk as the largest ocean carrier out there. Maybe they can stand alone. I've seen a lot of trade press talking about the fact that potentially they don't need any partners. The other thing to consider here is since Maersk and MSC are the two largest ocean carriers, they potentially were creating too much market share in this alliance. And so what happens with this alliance is that they're granted antitrust immunity, meaning even though they're a monopoly, they're allowed to be a monopoly because of their benefit to the ocean shipping community and because the Federal Maritime Commission is very closely monitoring everything to make sure that it's not at the detriment of the U.S. importer, exporter, or consumer.
And Lauren, that was going to be around my next question was this potentially done strategically in order to avoid some of those associations? When we're looking at this situation here, it really kind of seems like this could just kind of resume as business as usual, and maybe it won't be such a huge deal after all. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think you're seeing a lot of people who are close to ocean shipping, say, "Oh, okay, this is happening." I think what we might see is maybe some other alliance shifting. There's some interesting clauses in some of the other alliance agreements where they say that they can't be essentially they can't expire until 2027 is for the Ocean Alliance, and then the Alliance, THE Alliance, which is actually the high. The High Efficiency Alliance, I believe, is what the longer term for the alliance is. But that one isn't supposed to expire until 2030. I'm not exactly sure if that means that they can't shuffle a little bit. But in terms of kind of dissolving the agreements, those can't quite happen. We have seen an uptick, and Rachel Premack was talking about this with Dooner yesterday on What the Truck. There's been a lot of slot charter agreements. And so sometimes in these agreements, and certainly in 2M, it affords for these slot charters outside of the otherwise agreed to terms. Basically, it says you have to look inside the agreement first to see if you have slot charters available. If you're lacking a certain route, or maybe you need more capacity on a certain route, you're able to go kind of partner in this limited way with another ocean carrier. But at least in 2M, it said you had to look inside. We saw Zim taking advantage of that with 2M. Zim worked with 2M quite a bit on these slot charters. We're seeing kind of an uptick in those. So maybe that will help move the pendulum away from alliances. I don't think we're going to get rid of alliances by any means. I think that as a whole in ocean shipping, we've really benefited as a shipping public.
Well, I feel like also, given the pandemic-related disruption of the past 2 years, a lot of people had been talking about these alliances almost like a cartel. Fear that governments, when regulators would start paying attention. Does this look like this may be preemptive to try and get ahead on the narrative, or is this something where maybe we'll see alliance by another name?
I think we're still going to see alliances. It is accurate, although a little disparaging to call them cartels. They are monopolies, but they are granted this antitrust immunity, which is basically monopoly immunity. Because, like I said, the Federal Maritime Commission has been charged with watching and monitoring the activities here to make sure that it doesn't turn into a monopoly that's harmful for the overall ocean shipping world and the overall consumer. So, I think that we're still going to see alliances. There was a lot of rhetoric set calling them cartels, which kind of invokes this like they're bad guys. Alliances are not bad things, and these carriers are not necessarily bad guys. There was robust competition that the FMC looked closely at. And believe me, the FMC probably know more than anybody else wanted to say they're messing up this competition world. They're all being too monopolistic. We want to shut them all down. But they didn't find that. During COVID, they reviewed and they found, look, there's robust competition here, because even though we have these alliances, we have 3 alliances out there, and each one really represents about 20-30% market share. 2M Alliance was starting to edge up in the 40% market share. And that's where I think, from your question specifically, where it could be a little bit troublesome. Potentially, they could be coming under some higher scrutiny. If you have 40% market share on any trade lane, that's going to be a lot of market share, obviously. And you're getting a little bit too much control. Typically, I think foreign governments like to see the 20-30%. So we have the Federal Maritime Commission reviewing it. European Union has the European Commission reviewing it through DG Competition, and certainly China has a similar. Really, all major governments out there are watching this, and so that 40% might just not sit well with certain governments.
And Lauren, I love your take on this, and I'm sure many watching as well also enjoy this take and want more of your content. And you are a busy woman, adjunct professor at many institutions, also have the Maritime Professor and founder and principal over at the Squall Strategies. So if people want to get in touch with you, continue this conversation, find more of your content, how can they do that?
Sure. So every Friday I host a podcast called By Land and By Sea, and that's probably the best way to kind of approach me. So it's called By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain. We hit kind of the recent topics of the week, certainly the trends that the Federal Maritime Commission is looking at, but you can check that out on themaritimprofessor.com, anywhere that you get your podcast. But if you do have a legal question, I am a lawyer. I do take cases certainly related to ocean shipping. So that's squallstrategies.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show as well. And looking forward to checking out as well the podcast. So fellow podcast people, we do it ourselves. Always good to help out and get good information as well.
Thank you very much. So great to talk to you guys today.
Awesome. We'll chat with you again soon, Lauren. And right now we're going to take a short break, but impressive. So professor at a few different institutions, lawyer, podcaster, CEO and founder. What can she do?
I gotta step it up.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask the evergreen ever stuck question. I had that in the back pocket, but my Alliance for Ships Not Getting Stuck idea has not yet come to fruition.
Stick with us after this short break because we have more FreightWaves Now coming up.
The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest Freight Tech news at FreightWaves.com.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation, inflation, inflation. This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston. Drilling Deep is the place where we talk about oil and we talk about diesel, and you have to drill to get oil and you have to get oil to make diesel, so that's why we call it Drilling Deep. Drilling Deep drops every Friday on FreightWaves TV and all available podcast platforms.
Welcome into this week's On the Spot segment. I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by a familiar face, Donnie Gilbert. Donnie, switch roles a little here. I got to pick the charts for this one. So we're going to talk a little about what's going on in the railroad industry, only because, one, they report earnings a little earlier than most, but you have J.B. Hunt, who reports really first out of anybody, and they have a big intermodal play. Obviously, they're not a railroad, but they're exposed to the rails more than most other carriers are when we think of maybe transportation providers. But if you want to compare a J.B. Hunt with other truckload carriers, their exposure's largely on the rail side.
But right before COVID, when everything was shut down, I saw multiple pictures of some J.B. Hunt yards that were near the rail. And basically it was J.B. Hunt containers, because they have their own containers that they run their rail stuff with. And they were about 6 high and 100, 150 long, and there were several rows of those. It was just container after container stacked up because they were empty and not able to use that. But obviously that's changed now. But let's jump in here, Tony. This rail data is going to be very fun to go through. The rail's very different. We'll pull up
our first chart, and in Sonar, we're able to see container volumes, and there's other sources out there that have container volumes, but they're looked at holistic, or as intermodal volumes as a whole. Right?
Yeah.
We're able to break it down domestic versus international, because really that's two separate markets, right? We're talking domestic, you're looking at your hub groups, your J.B. Hunts, your truckload carriers like a Schneider, who has a large intermodal play. So, I mean, you're looking at those, I mean, Swift, another one, right? Has a large intermodal play. That's what we're looking at here, as opposed to the international side, where those containers are owned primarily by the steamship lines and those container ships. So first chart here, we've got our outbound domestic rail volume, so those 53-foot container volumes, broken down annually, but only loaded, right? So not what are empties doing, these are outbound loaded volumes. Really, what I want to call out here on this side first is where we were in the fourth quarter and why you're seeing some of the results that you saw. Was in this blue bold line is that fourth quarter average versus, so in 2022, you can see the decline that we saw from 2021, and that was even lower than 2020. So 2020 was really the peak in rail, which is interesting. But I mean, if you think about all the issues that we've had on the rails with service metrics and things like that, not really surprised to see people moving away from the rail for that service on the truckload side.
There was a lot of time sensitivity, Tony.
That too.
During COVID. So when you hear, it might take 2 weeks to go from LAX on the rail to Chicago. If my map was here, LAX to Chicago. They didn't have that time because everything was so behind. Ships were being blocked at the ports. They needed it. So how do you fix that? You put it on a truck on a team in LAX, and it's in Chicago 2 days later.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one aspect. But I think one of the interesting things now is we've come back out of the holiday, right? We talk about it with OTVI.
We're right here.
But the issue is we've traded down, and this is a time frame that time sensitivity goes away, right? It should be an opportunity for the rails to grow intermodal volumes, and they've declined after we rebounded from the holiday. And I think that's a concern for me as a whole, is when you're looking at the marketplace right now. intermodal's still at a discount to truckload. Time sensitivity isn't necessarily there, and we're seeing volume levels decline. We talked about it yesterday on a carrier update, looking at ocean volumes and things like that. There really was no bump up or ramp up in the fourth quarter, but even leading into Lunar New Year, when those come off, they may get transloaded into this, but I mean, that stuff's moving on the rails into warehouses, maybe not necessarily into a truck immediately, right? So you would think, hey, maybe this would have held up maybe better than what you would have thought on the truckload side, but it's not necessarily the case.
We don't know how far back. We know a couple of different things. We know, one, we are overstocked here in the U.S. When did these volumes go to warehouse? Did it go ship, train, Chicago, then locals move it to Juliet into warehouses?
Yeah.
Did it go from LAX right into warehousing in LA? Or did it go to Atlanta and into warehouses? We know that our inventories are still growing. We know that our warehouses are very full. And Tony, some of this could have moved by rail back 9, 10, 12 months before, and they're all in warehouses now. And that's going to be a truck from that warehouse to a DC or to a store.
And you saying that brought up an idea in my head, and we'll bring up the next chart because we can break it down. And here we've got our outbound domestic container volumes, that same chart we were just looking at, but we've added long haul, outbound tender volumes, that mid haul and the short haul. If you look at long haul volumes, they peaked out earlier this month and they've dropped down from there. But what we've seen, we've talked about it, OTVI has been on the rise the past few days, and it's stemming largely from these shorter hauls and these mid hauls, which long haul trucking and intermodal are more competitive with each other because long hauls on the rail make more economic sense just from a cost perspective than truck. But if you think about that LA to Chicago, right? That's a long haul truck versus but across there's not a whole lot stopping somebody.
They say it's about a 700-mile rule. If it's less than 700 miles, then you don't use the rail. It's more cost effective to go with the truck. But it's going longer than 700 miles, then you can balance it. Is it time sensitive? You can use a truck. If it's not time sensitive, hey, keep it on the rail. It may save you a lot of money. So there's a coin flip there, yes. So all these down here that are the mid-haul and short hauls, that's going to be truckload volumes.
Exactly, and that's why what you said where, hey, this stuff may have been moved by rail 6-8 months ago, and now it's finally being moved by a truck, you can kind of see it somewhat happening, right? It may not be perfect one-to-one or anything like that, but it's a trend to pay attention to as we get further into the first quarter, but really into the second quarter, because if that stuff moved earlier, right, those shipments came in ahead of Lunar New Year, or they're on the ocean now, and then they'll get moved. Eventually it flows to a truck, but it's just where in the cycle or in the broader supply chain, where's that fit in that transportation market?
It looks like rail's going to need to prepare and stay with their bulk shipments for quite a while until things start to turn around, because once we see the ocean start to pick up, let's say you might see a pull forward, or that pull forward going on now, which will be a bump in volumes in 35 to 45 days. They'll pick up some freight from that, but that should be a constant every year battle. But they're going to be hurting a little bit until the regular products that we spend our excess money on start to pick up as well.
Yeah, we'll flip one more chart real quick. It'll be just a brief look at our contract rates. They're about to turn negative on the intermodal side. Not really a surprise, but it's one of those, there it is. I mean, we're right at where we were last year. We haven't seen necessarily rate increases on the intermodal side. So not really a surprise, but
this is going to drop below
2020. Yeah, they're going to turn negative at some point. It's just a matter of when. Donnie, thank you so much for joining me on this week's On the Spot. Right now, we'll take a quick break. We'll be back with more FreightWaves Now.
When guests come to an event like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
It's a good day coming.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation. This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now. So, Thomas, you know what some people wonder from time to time?
What, sir?
The state of freight. And we have you covered here. So if you go to FreightWaves.com, go to the events tab, and you can go see what we have available for this afternoon, and that's going to be the state of freight, which is going to be a live webinar with our very own CEO and founder, Craig Fuller, and Zach Strickland for
that's going to be a live State of Freight live webinar. Get hyped, right?
That's right. It's going to be live starting at 2 p.m. and it will provide a valuable conversation about the current state of the market and what to do to be successful, knowing in the next couple of months that will be hard. So this is going to be something that's going to be a high value for sure.
Exactly. You want good insights on what the heck is happening with our high frequency sonar data. Tune into this. We got some of the foremost experts and the boss. But to register though, folks, go to FreightWaves.com and look under the events tab for the upcoming webinar section. And if you miss it today, if you weren't watching, you're tuning in, it's going to be available on demand after its conclusion. So it's not going away, folks. This knowledge is valuable and it will stick around.
That's right, and that's going to be live today, and it's going to be something that I believe is going to happen on a quarterly basis, so that's going to be something to watch for, and as we continue to move throughout the year, because it's definitely going to be a volatile one.
Exactly, folks. If you're anyone in the supply chain, whether you're making decisions or want to hopefully make decisions one day, check it out. It's going to have some good nuggets of knowledge, folks, and just like when you're panning as a prospector, there's golden in their hills.
And this is going to be a good thing to kind of lead into our next live event, or virtual event, I should say, is going to be, of course, Global Supply Chain Week, and that's going to be a big one as well. But coming up next, we're going to have the Freight Convo, and that's a new segment that we're debuting today. And if you want to see the full thing, you got to go on to youtube.com, go to FreightWaves, and you can see the full video here, but we're segmenting it today, and it's going to be an amazing segment to watch.
Exactly. We'll be asking leaders about their thoughts as well, what's going on, and then the next person will give their thoughts after what was said. So an ongoing conversation. You're only going to get about 10 minutes of it today, but there's actually a 22-minute interview with Omar, and so check it out, folks, as well on YouTube after we air it right now.
Welcome into our first Thursday conversation ever here in January. And joining us on our first Thursday conversation is Omar Singh, President and CEO and founder of Surge Transportation. Omar, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Bill. Thanks for having me today. Happy to
Thanks
be
for.
on. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for being our first Thursday conversation. I want to open up the thing just kind of very blandly and just kind of ask you, you've been in this industry for a while. You know the ins and outs of what's going on here. What's the question that the freight industry should be asking itself right now?
I mean, I think if every single conversation I'm having with people is, they're trying to do the forecast and the outlook for 2023. Right. I mean, it's a very challenging environment for trucking companies. It's a challenging environment for freight brokers. I mean, so I think people are really looking at the economy. They're really looking at import volumes. They're really looking at fuel prices and just all of the different political things that are happening in the world that affect fuel and demand. So I think people are kind of, cycles are cycles. Kind of you have your lows and your highs over the years, right? And they say 2019 was the last real low, but it wasn't a recession. 2008 was the recession, way different than just a down cycle. So I think that's what's on everyone's minds.
Yeah, let's go into that just a little bit. I had a chance to listen to your Fuller Speed Ahead with George Abernathy, which was about 15, 16 months ago or so. You mentioned a phrase in there that I had not necessarily heard. In fact, I had never heard it until you mentioned it, which was in getting through the 2008, 2009 period, you said you wanted to be stronger than the recession. What does that mean now?
Well, I think now, I think preparing ahead of time rather than sort of being very reactive. Mm-hmm. And so, back almost 15 years ago, for me, I was a lot less experienced in business. And so I think that I really did a lot of reacting rather than, kind of forecasting and preparing. So currently, we've been watching this, and I think things kind of changed a lot faster than we thought they were going to last April, in May. But I think being able to make quick decisions, sometimes I hate to admit hard decisions, because we want to be here and we want to survive. And sometimes, it's really challenging to make adjustments that kind of help you get through those periods, at times. But when you realize you have to, and it's for the good of, the whole, it's very challenging. But I think, learning to operate leaner, investing in technology, having, lower operating costs. But so I guess now I'm doing a lot more preparing than I did in the past.
Yeah. Those three things you just mentioned, is that your kind of toolkit for where you want to be? Those are the three things you're watching 24/7?
Yeah, I think we have to be at all times, right? Because things change too month to month. Now, again, being a little bit more prepared, you kind of look at your P&L and you can see where maybe you have the same revenue and the same margin in certain months, but if your costs are different, it can really just change things very quickly. So week to week, month to month, just really have to be paying attention to it. Yeah.
So going back to that period of time, 2008, 2010, you had your trucking company. You were trying to outlast the recession at that point. What were maybe one of the things that you brought up constantly or consistently in that talk was doing the hard job, coming up and trying to do the hard job. You had been in furniture movement, you had been in academia. Those are hard things to do. Right now, what do you think maybe are the hard jobs now, or are they still the same that people will have to dig down and do to get through this period?
Well, I think our business model hasn't really changed a lot since then, to be honest with you. So, our business model has always been some form of business continuity, which is, backup, overflow, short lead time, seasonal kind of, rejections that other motor carriers don't want for one reason or another, if it's a multi-stop or whatever the issue is. And I think that's still very much alive and well in Surge. And now, we're doing a lot of pricing with the APIs, but it's still kind of a pressure cooker environment to not really have as much routing guide freight as we do just sort of market rates, market demand, short lead time, where it really is a pressure cooker in short lead time, and the team's not set up for kind of immediately requesting appointments, so we're in compliance and able to get them, really being a 24/7 operation. I mean, it's still very much alive and well to say we're taking the challenging freight that a lot of other people, you know, if you get an award, I always use Jacksonville to Chicago because those are our offices, but, you know, 150 loads a year, one on Monday, one on Wednesday, one on Friday, you know, and you can just source that a lot differently than just kind of the pressure loads. So.
Yeah, absolutely there. So you said the business strategy doesn't necessarily change that much. Back in that other conversation, you said the primary be the primary, the brokers get everything else.
Right.
And you cover the things that the primaries can't do. That's still a one point for you.
Yeah. Either they can't do or they don't want to do it, right? So it's still kind of taking the stuff that nobody else wants to do and saying, all right, we'll do it. I mean, we need to be valuable to you. So
how satisfying is it that the business model hasn't had to change given the ebb and flow of the economy?
Well, I like it. I mean, I think that we have a very strong relationship with our customers, you know, and with our motor carriers, of course. But it gives us sort of a valuable strategic reason to have a relationship with them, to be doing something that other people don't want to do or they can't do. Maybe they're just not set up from a staffing point to do it, or they don't desire, you know, to work nights and weekends and holidays, you know, all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that it's certainly, you know, when often you'll hear shippers say they don't want to add brokers because they already have whatever their number is, if it's 5 or if it's 10 or whatever. I think that what that comes from isn't so much a quantity as a quality. Like, well, you know, I'll add you if you're doing something different, if you're valuable to me and you're going to do it in a way that the other 9 people in the network don't do it, right? So, and we do. I mean, maybe, I don't know if you'd be surprised or something, but I have very close relationships with our customers, you know, that bleed into become friendships, you know, and our children know each other. And because it's important work, you know, that I think a lot of people aren't able to do.
I think that's really important, especially when you get into situations like this where you have, I mean, it's the relationships that are going to keep you going too as well, just because, like you said, you know, if you're servicing customers that know you by your first name, that know your family, those relationships are going to stand the test of time, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, we have to be priced correctly, right? I mean, it's not that just because you have a relationship, you can charge more or whatever, but, you know, you also have conversations where, you know, when the market's tight, of course, rates are higher, and when it's loose, they're lower, and everybody has to have just a, I think, frank and sincere conversation about why things are happening the way they are, and kind of, you know, how do we all adapt together in this kind of market style business model, you know?
You mentioned at the top of the program about, you know, calculating how you're going to forecast 2023. Anything more specifically about that in terms of those conversations that you're having with your associates, with your customers, in terms of, you know, how do I map out Q1, Q2? Hopefully we won't get to Q3 and Q4 and be in the same spot.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for us, it's preparing a lot of it's internally, also preparing, you know, with our motor carriers to kind of have conversations about, you know, where we're seeing the demand, and then in terms of kind of our own, honestly, staffing and hiring or decisions not to hire, right? And then how can we build efficiency so that when things pick up, maybe we can continue to do more, you know, without hiring too early, right? Because payroll is our single biggest expense after motor carrier pay, right? So we want to be, you know, very cognizant of that, but we also, you know, we don't want to sort of, like, I'm forecasting Q2 to be much stronger than Q1, but at the same time, in case we're wrong, I'm not hiring for Q2 right now. I'm going to try to hold what we've got and see if we can kind of add that volume without adding people, because if it doesn't come, then you end up, you know, having to lay off or something, and nobody wants to do that,
right?
You know, somebody's life.
In your own forecasting, is that about how far you want to stay ahead of the game, basically one quarter, or have you gone farther or shorter than that, depending on the economic situation?
Well, I think for us, I think probably 2 quarters is safe. You know, I mean, 3 quarters, you know, we think we're going to start seeing things tick up in Q2 and then really in Q3 and then naturally in Q4. So to a certain extent, I'm forecasting out 4 quarters. But really in terms of like staffing and, office space and, investments in whether it's furniture or whatever, then I would say, yeah, we're 2 quarters out, right?
Okay.
In terms of what are we doing with that?
Where do you want to take the conversation if you're at the podium and you get to moderate? Where would you like to see this industry? What would you like to see this industry talk about as it moves forward?
I think that I enjoy the opportunities to collaborate, right, with each other. I mean, so in our kind of there's a open API initiative, and there are a lot of companies like TextLocate and Surge and some of the others that are starting to contribute their data to try to, and we don't even really know where it's going yet, but to kind of share as much as we can so we can have, it's called this open visibility network.
Right.
And just kind of try to make each other kind of better, help each other kind of learn what the, as they say, the art of the possible is. And so we're all kind of contributing our information into this community right now, into this network. We don't even really know where it's going to go yet. But I like to see the collaboration. It's a very fragmented industry. I think it stays a fragmented industry with tens of thousands of brokers and, tens of thousands of motor carriers. But I think there's also a way for us to collaborate together better. And not only have we been fragmented, I think we've been somewhat siloed in the past. And, Freight Tech is kind of starting to bring some of that together and break down the silos, even though we may continue to be fragmented, but maybe not fragmented and siloed, just fragmented. So I think that would be very exciting for me to see happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. Omar Singh, founder and CEO of Surge Transportation, thanks for joining us on our Thursday conversation.
I appreciate it, Bill. Good to see you.
And that was the debut of the Freight Conversation, and that was just the part of it. You can find the full thing on YouTube and go, of course, to FreightWaves page on YouTube, and you can see the full conversation there. Right now, we're going to head over to headlines.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Thomas Wasson for a final look at the news. Nikola Corp is sending 15 hydrogen-powered fuel cell trucks to California in the 4th quarter. It's the first step in fulfilling Anheuser-Busch InBev's long-standing order for up to 800 of the zero-emission vehicles. Separately, the startup electric truck maker also announced Hyla, a brand new brand covering its hydrogen production, distribution, and dispensing business. It's hoping to plan by 60 stations around 2026. Hapeng Lloyd, in other news, on Wednesday signed a binding agreement to acquire a 35% stake in JM Baxi Ports and Logistics Limited. It's actually publicly traded, a private terminal and inland transport service provider in India. The seller is Bain Capital private equity affiliates, Hapeng Lloyd said. Hapeng Lloyd said also that JMBPL's operations include container terminals, a multi-purpose terminal, inland container depots, container freight stations, and logistics offerings such as rail services. The company employs around 5,400 people and handles about 1.6 million TEUs annually. Also, third-party logistics provider Fitzmark said Wednesday it had acquired truck broker GTO 2000. Gainesville-based GTO 2000 focuses primarily on temperature-controlled truckload transportation. The nearly 50-year-old company boasts a network of more than 14,000 carriers, which also provide dry van, flatbed, expedited, intermodal, and less-than-truckload transportation. Financial terms of the transaction were not provided. The transaction marked the 7th acquisition over the past 4 years for Fitzmark, which has been rolling up 3PLs with the help of a private equity firm, Calera Capital. Now, you can find these details of these stories and more on FreightWaves.com and the FreightWaves app. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. For the full FreightWaves TV experience, head on over to tv.freightwaves.com. That's it for the news, though, but we have a little bit more left. We're tossing over to Tony for the carrier update.
Welcome into the final carrier update of the morning, Donnie. It's our lanes of the day. We're going to start here. Houston was one of those markets that was popping up in our OTMS chart where it's been able to take some market share from those markets across the rest of the country, growing, not necessarily growing freight volumes, but maybe not losing freight volumes.
Yeah, it grew in size. So how do you test the theory? Well, let's use a market dashboard. So when you see these markets you may or may not operate in or may be thinking about it, hey, start throwing lanes up on the market dashboard and see how they're reacting. Just immediately, Houston from January 1st has come up to a little bit of a peak after the holidays. Now, currently, they're on their way back down just a little bit, but still, this shows part of its a lot of lanes did not grow their rates during the first 2 or 3 weeks of January. We're at 237 for almost 800 miles. We'll call it 800. That's a tough one. You look at revenue per day. This is one of those lanes that it being 800 miles, it's not a one-day run.
Yeah.
It's not a 2-day run. It's about a 1.5, and you got to really do some timing. Throw a break in there. It may make it 2 days. So here we'll call this a 2-day run, and you start dividing out the math, and you're around, I think $1,200 or $1,300, whatever, per day. So it looks good for daily revenue. Now hit a little double arrows button there, and let's look at what it is going back. $1.97. So it's even cheaper going back. So you'd want to probably run this side, maybe run it on contract and come back the other way using your spot if you have to. But together, you're still, I think, around $1,100 a day in revenues. If you can cut this whole thing in 3 days, you can get about $1,100 in revenue on that truck per day. Any longer, you're going to struggle with what everybody else is struggling with. So I guess my point being is these are real lanes. These are guys that are out there running these lanes right now, and if their costs are not minimized, then they're going to be the ones going out of business because they're getting real close to running their cost at just that $900,000 per day revenues.
Now, the good news when looking at this lane is that there's volume behind it, and that's the good news is you're connecting. And at the moment, 2 head haul markets. So you're able to keep that capacity utilization high. That's the good news on this,
right? For big carriers, yes.
Yeah.
But for small guys, you're running your truck at break even and can't bring it home to mama and the kids.
Yeah, that makes it tough.
That's tough.
Yep.
So, and that's what's happening. That's what's going to be happening if these rates get any lower. But as you can see, the backhaul, this is kind of the backhaul for this one. It's been pretty steady here, but the other one is the other side, Houston going to Atlanta, has been dropping down. Let's go to a few more here right quick. We'll jump in, Dallas to Houston, 342, it jumped up there again. You can use your market dashboard into November, into December, into January now. You see a boost in these rates at the end of the month. Keep that in mind. Swap it up, go back Houston to Dallas. Again, it's 273. So this is about in the norm right now of where this lane really should be, except for the fact that fuel costs are higher. One more, the one I want to get to is LA going to Dallas. And here, it's continuing to go down. There's a lot less demand on this lane, which is pushing the rate down. So if we go and hit the double arrows and go Dallas out to LA, my point on this lane is you're getting paid the same to run out to LA, but you're picking up freight that pays a lot less to come back home. Is that lane worth it here? And what's going to happen? You might see a lot of people start refusing to go to LAX because of these rates, which might help push this rate up.
Yep, awesome stuff. As always, Donnie will be sure to check in with you again tomorrow. Right now, we'll hand it back over to Thomas and Anthony.
Thomas, this is going to take us to the end of the show for today, but that doesn't mean that the end of the content for the day.
Exactly. This may be one ending, but we have new beginnings, folks. And one of the big ones is a webinar that's coming up today. It's one with Zach Strickland and FreightWaves CEO and founder Craig Fuller talking about the state of freight at 2 p.m. Eastern.
That's right. You can go get registered for that one at FreightWaves.com under the events tab for the upcoming webinar, and you can watch it on demand. So say you are busy. I know it might be a little bit short notice for you, but you can go and watch that again, and maybe you did watch it, but you just want to break down some of the points. You can go and take all your notes.
Exactly. And we also have, as well, in between that spaced around, we'll have Business Air TV as well as Taking the High Road. So full action-packed thing, as well as refuel. Thankfully, we got the graphic up there. This will help out. But pull it back up. We have some time. I was reading the other one. But anyways, check them all out, of course, tv.freightwaves.com. You can check it out under shows as well. And if you do miss it live, it's still going to be there on demand, of course, on the website. And finally, Global Supply Chain Week for folks. We need the people to sign up February 20 through 24th.
That's right, and this is going to be something for everyone if you're involved in the supply chain every single day. There's going to be giveaways for those who register, and of course, amazing networking opportunities for those in-person events coming up later on this year. That's going to do it for today's show, but tune in tomorrow morning. We'll be right back with more FreightWaves Now.
And stay classy.